right. If you mind, go ahead and get started with everybody, please. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Narendra Malik, and I'm the Vice Chair for Facility Disposition and Site Remediation Committee. There are a couple of things please note. When you speak, come to the microphone, give your name and association with the organization. We stress that during the meeting, please do not communicate with individuals. Every discussion is being recorded live, so make sure that there's no unnecessary recording during the meeting. There will be a period for public comments. Please sign up your name for the public comments and come to the podium to speak. All members of the CAB, please sign your attendance sheet. Encourage participation from all CAB members and the public. There is no open recommendation.
Nope. And we can ask Avery to come and give her.
Avery, please.
Good afternoon, Avery Hammett, Department of Energy. And since our last meeting, just a few weeks ago, we have a few things. SRS has issued 2 environmental bulletins. On March 27th, excuse me, a notice of public availability was put out for the 5-year remedy review report for the Savannah River site operable units with geosynthetic stabilization or solidification cover systems. So that's just for your information. It's out there available for you to look at if you would like. And the 5-year remedy review documents the verification efforts taken by DOE, EPA, and DHEC to confirm that the remedy selected for a waste unit is still effective and is effectively doing what it's supposed to do to manage the waste and keep the environment and human health safe. So that is out there. And the second one is a little bit more interesting as far as there's an option for public comment. On April 10th, the public comment period started for the removal site evaluation report for the P area groundwater operable unit. And the preferred remedy here, or removal action that's going to be taken, is the installation of a subsurface permeable reactive barrier to treat some of the groundwater plumes that contain TCE. And the barrier is going to use a technology involving zero valent iron in the groundwater, and it's going to passively treat the TCE in the groundwater as it passes through this sort of gate in the wall. It'll funnel the groundwater to channel it through this iron and remove the TCE and hopefully greatly reduce the amount of TCE making its way to Steel Creek. So that document is out for public comment for 30 days, so starting April 10th and ending May 10th. And if anyone is unfamiliar with the environmental bulletin process, I have 2 hard copies, one of each, and they do have a form on the back where you can sign up to receive environmental bulletins if you're new to the CAB and aren't getting those or are interested. I have these, so you can come and grab those from me. And one more item, we had the annual comprehensive monitoring evaluation for groundwater at the site conducted by DHEC and EPA on March 26th to 27th, and there were no findings or deficiencies noted during that inspection. So again, that's our regulators double checking and making sure that we are monitoring groundwater the way we should, keeping our wells in good condition, and they do a data review and a records review and stuff too. So no findings or concerns with that. And that's all I have. Any questions?
Narendra Malik, I have one simple question. Maybe I do not understand properly. when we get the email from James that here are the environmental reports, there are 3 or 4 pages, but at the end says the whole document is available at either Augusta State University or South Carolina State University. Is there any possibility that a link could be attached to that so we can look at the document? If I have missed it, you may have been doing that.
I think that there is a link in the environmental bulletin to where it is posted on the SRS website. So near the end of the environmental bulletin, it should say an electronic copy is posted at the following address with a hyperlink. So you should be able to get an electronic version then. It's hard to email these big documents because they will bog down your email system.
I know that.
So they're they're huge. So the link is provided instead of the actual document.
Thank you.
So
Any more questions?
anything else? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so for those of you new to the cabinet, refresher for everybody else, if you remember at the full board meeting, you received presentations on, a general overview on how remediation projects are completed at the site and South Carolina DHEC's ESOP program. And so we're going to give you a few moments, or really the rest of the meeting, to talk amongst yourselves about those presentations, what you learned from them, what you think could be different about the activities. If you had any impressions that you want to share or any thoughts, now would be the time to do it. And we also have a couple folks in the audience who are ready to answer your questions as best they can, and we can take actions for those that we can't get to. So first, if you want to, look in your handouts for those of you who brought yours back from the full board. Let's go to the remediation projects presentation, and that one was from Kathy Lewis from SRS. And so, are there any thoughts about that one? Any questions that you had?
Dave Vovakes, CAB. The one thing that I noticed is that on, I think it was slide 3, it said that there was, for environmental cleanup at SRS, there was an 85% footprint reduction, which is consistent with what I see out on the CAB website. But then on slide, I think it was slide 37, there was something that said that the decommissioning would not be complete until 2050, it looks like. The training on the CAB website indicates that the cleanup and decommissioning will be complete by 2031. So that's a difference there that I was trying to reconcile. I did send an email, I think, to James, and but I noticed that the training is still different from what's in this presentation.
Those are produced and paid for by the department. The training videos that were put out, there's a cost for us to change that voiceover, and so once we're able to do it, it's just not something that we can send an email on and get that changed the next day and get that updated. I believe when we produced those, we intended to make them so that they had a shelf life of 5 years, but obviously that 2031 and 2048 date moved things out a little bit.
Yeah. However, I still do have a concern that even though we are consistent with 85% complete on the CAB training and also in this presentation, to have that date move out so far from 2031, another almost 20 years, I'd like to know what's going on, that it's that much of a difference now.
May I add something, Avery, if you will please help me understand that? I think the footprint, yes, I can understand 85% complete, but the 2050 is the final closure of the areas. That's what my understanding is.
Avery, Hammett, DOE. The final closure date for the areas on site has shifted because of ongoing missions. is one of the main reasons, because we can't remediate facilities that still have an active mission. And also budgets and prioritization, and so it's sort of a fluctuating date depending on the current needs for those facilities and those the uses of those areas is the primary driver for that. So as James was saying, the date in the training is was the correct date at that time. You know, that was a snapshot. So it is hard to keep everything updated, but I think that Kathy's presentation reflects more recent data than what's on the website on your training. So.
Mike McLean is DOE. Just to amplify a little bit of what Avery put out, she's absolutely right. The projections that you're seeing in these slides, and when dates shift to the left or the right, they're based on the planning assumptions were given by the current administration and the previous administration. So when a new administration comes in, or the budgetary guidance we get from the Office of Management Budget or from Congress, you know, flat budgets, a certain percentage increase, we have to shift the work based within those budgets. In some cases, it pushed the operating life of the facility, such as my H Canyon, out a few more years before we can process all the spent fuel, and they can't get into H area to start closing this, so that delays some of the cleanup actions. You'll see it's much like a balloon. When you start squeezing it a little bit and constraining it by funding, the balloon will shift a little bit more to the right, and that's what you're seeing in this case. At one point, when these things, we had a goal at one time of closing the tank farms by 2021, but that required a whole lot more resources being put into the tank farms for emptying and some technology development that never came to fruition from an appropriation space.
Dave Vovakes, CAB, would you consider 19 years would you quantify that as a slight shift?
It all depends upon the planning assumptions. I mean, you can take a few percent in escalation and change it, and it can cause a significant shift. So small changes in the planning assumptions can cause a lot of perturbation when you're looking 40 and 50 years into the future. If I had characterized a shift from of that time as the shift itself as being slight, I apologize for that. It'll cause shifts.
Any more comments?
Dan
Dave.
Kaminski, CAB. And I think not to necessarily defend DOE on it, but I also would think that the law of diminishing returns would come into play, where it's easy to scoop things up when the whole place needed to be clean. As you get to the finer points, you've also saved some of the hardest stuff for last, right?
Mike McLean, DOE. When it comes to the percentages, no, you're absolutely correct.
And is that on area, or is that on, Susan's not here, so I'll ask the question, is that on Curie's, or?
That's a good question. I believe it's in the area of the operating facility footprint, like H area.
I believe it is too.
But I don't believe it's based on Curie's. But we can get an answer for you if you want that.
Susan would appreciate it.
We'll take an action to get that for you. But you're absolutely correct about the percentages. The 515 waste units that were originally there, and we're down to a much smaller number now. Those were a lot easier to get to, a lot easier to remediate. Now we're stuck with some of the plumes that take years to just pump and treat, or for natural attenuation and all the different technologies to work.
I had just a couple of questions. Slide 7 shows a couple of, I'm not sure which reactors. I didn't take a note on that. And I had a question written down as exactly how high above the groundwater do those facilities rest? So I don't know if they'll be able to answer that question tonight, and that's fine.
We'll have to get you an answer.
And just so, kind of for a common understanding, since it is kind of on the small side, is that the same reactor on the top picture as the bottom picture, just showing the before and after grouting operations?
If it's, Mike Michelangelo, Steve, if it's not the same reactor, it's indicative of one. The reactors were pretty much carbon copies of the others in footprints. They were all pretty much the same design, same time frame for construction. And one point about the water table will shift over time, so depending upon the site water usage, there are some facilities where the below ground portions are actually immersed in the water table. So in some facilities, it could be above the water table, some it could be within, if you're interested in which, we'll find out which particular facility here is depicted.
Yeah, and
get you a distance.
actually, I think I have more of a reaching question on the groundwater. So this shows a grouted closed reactor. So yeah,
Correct.
once it's grouted below grade, I understand that that's, you know, the designed containment action. What I'd also be interested in knowing is how far that groundwater is from Lake El Area Basin. Because to me, I mean, that's, we've known they'd have some leaks in the past, or at least testing. I don't really remember the details of that. And, you know, that would be something that would be very difficult to monitor seepage at some point. And just wondering how far that is from the groundwater.
Avery Hammett, DOE. The reactor pictured here is either P or R reactor, so that would...
They're essentially identical anyway, right?
Right.
As far as I would
I
know.
can't remember which one is which from the pic, and I can't read the text because my eyes are too bad. But so it wouldn't be anywhere near L, basin. So I thought that SRS was going to have one of their technical people here, so hopefully they'll come and be able to answer all of these questions that we're writing down. But we'll get you an answer.
And then I just, other notes I had in there that I don't think we discussed at the full cab was, or maybe someone brought it up and I just jotted it down as well. On slide 26, so the FIRO remediation is basically, is that the proverbial dilution is the solution for the pollution with the aeration of the pond water?
Mike Michelangelo, Stevie. No, actually, this is an innovative concept with the technology. It collects the groundwater as it seeps out, and we use it to irrigate the plants. We biofix the tritium into the vegetation while it decays. So some of it will be released in the air through evapotranspiration, but other portions of it will be bound up within the cellular structure of the trees themselves and decay naturally. So it's both.
It's purposely aerating it into the tree area.
Correct.
Okay.
We're not just sprinkling. In fact, we have to get the state's buy-in to be able to use any to be able to apply this water anywhere.
Okay, no, that's good. Thank you.
Dan, if I can add that last year we had Forest Services come and give us a talk on this issue, that they were spraying tritium-related contaminated water in the forest, and it's in very dilute quantities.
Here, well, I assumed it would be.
We'd evaluated for impact on the firefighting and the control burns that we did.
Avery Hammett, DOE, and it's also exclusively over the footprint of the plume, of the groundwater plume. So, and that's in our permit. But I did just find one of my pictures from a field visit out to the reactors, and this is P reactor in this picture. And it does have slightly deeper groundwater than R regionally, but I don't have the specific depth, so we'll still get you that.
Yes, Patty.
Betty Cook Cab. I just have a question. When we have an excessive amount of rain, does this affect the ground level water?
Mike Michelangelo, DOE. Now I'm going to have to break into my graduate studies for this. We'll get you a definitive answer on that. But from what I remember when I studied, no. Generally, when you get a lot of rain, it'll change the levels of surface water, rivers, lakes, etc. It takes a lot of time for the water to percolate down through the soils down to the groundwater table. It depends upon the depth of the groundwater. Generally, what will cause significant changes in the groundwater that we've seen at the Savannah Riverside, at least what came to my attention as in my previous job as Assistant Manager for Infrastructure and Environmental Stewardship, was the site's use of pulling water out of the ground and using it for domestic use or makeup water within the process facilities. So yes, if you take a lot of water out of the groundwater, or you can have a significant impact then on the groundwater. But over time, it takes years for it to vary over time.
Thank you.
Did I get that
Avery
right?
Hammett, yes. Just one elaboration. Long-term drought conditions do affect groundwater levels, but as Michael said, it's years. It's not one rainstorm. So a prolonged, reduced amount of rainfall will affect groundwater levels, but that's a long-term impact. So.
One more question, Betty Cook Cab. When you have taken away the timber, like cutting the trees and this type of things, in certain areas, doesn't that increase the water level? In other words, if you vacate the timber and it makes the water lay up more?
It can increase the runoff when
Yes.
when you remove the trees, so it can impact surface water levels because the water will move faster across the ground and not percolate through, and then hit the closest body of water, and then
Lowest area.
so it can raise surface water levels. I'm not sure about impacts to groundwater levels from tree removal.
I'd have to take a look up on that one.
Thank you.
Would you look at that one up?
Yes.
Find out what that does.
Any more questions?
You guys are hard. I feel like I'm back in grad school again. These are good questions.
Any comments from public?
Yes, ma'am, please.
Have a seat. Bobby Williams, Cap. My question is, the logging companies that are allowed to log trees out there, are they allowed to cut those trees that have been irrigated with tritium,
No.
tritiated water?
No, they're not in the footprint of what we harvest out. I'll verify that. None of them are old enough right now to be harvested, and I don't know what the disposition plans are for. Normally, we harvest the Forest Service, and this is Mike McLean, just for the transcript. Normally, we have the Forest Service harvest a certain area of the site to be able to manage the natural resource, to sell it, and to help pay for the other caretaking they do on the site. To the best of my knowledge, and I'm speculating at this point, but we'll find you the answer on that, there's no harm in letting those trees grow for the rest of the time we're here on the site, and until they would know any tritium that's entrained within the wood fibers themselves would be gone. But no, we're not harvesting out there currently. Nor am I aware of any plans to do that either, but we'll confirm that for you.
And just to kind of plus up this, since there's a lot of questions surrounding this in particular, and you're talking about the trees and the runoff and the harvesting, the Forest Service will be at your May meeting, and we'll give you guys a chance to ask him any and all the questions you
Yeah,
have
that'd be
on
a
this
good
one.
question. I think that would be an excellent question to raise up there. You could definitely get the definitive answer.
Yes, yeah, we'll still take these actions and answer them. Absolutely,
Yes.
we'll do that. But just as an aside, the guy's coming.
Any more questions from the public?
So do you want to move over to the ESOP presentation then? And so this was the second presentation. This is the one that Beth Cameron gave towards the end of the day on Tuesday. And she went over some of DHEC's environmental activities related to the site and observations that they make. So what kind of questions did you have or impressions that you got from this particular presentation? What do you have?
Does anybody has any questions on this?
Dan?
Just a comment. I haven't gone through all my notes yet, but it was very reassuring that DHEC supports the findings over a long period of time, that they have direct, close correlation of their testing and monitoring versus the self-monitoring that DOE performs. And I think that's highly commendable of DOE, that clearly we're reporting this above board and taking the necessary steps to protect us all. So I do appreciate that.
Jim,
Jim Gil, CAB. The presentation seemed to stop at about the middle of the river. As soon as things got to Georgia, we were left with a big blank space. I was curious, do we have equivalent activities taking place on the Georgia side? Is there somebody who can speak to that?
So Mike McLean's DOE, yes, in fact, the CAB has looked at that many times. As a new member to the CAB, I can refresh you to some of the history. In fact, the CAB made a recommendation to go back and try and support Georgia's environmental monitoring program adjacent to the site. At one point in time, the state of Georgia had an active environmental monitoring system around the site, much like DHEC was. Funding became an issue. We did offer to have a grant open to them, but there were some, when the department makes money available like that, there's a fairly significant administrative burden to working with the federal government like that. And what had been reported to me was the program would not have worked for Georgia, and they declined to go do it, and there was no need to do the kind of monitoring that South Carolina does from Georgia's perspective, so they have not created anything specific for the Savannah River site, much like Georgia, like South Carolina has. However, I will also go, we in the recommendation that was given, we had the ecology lab go look at, it's been the site's position and technical position that the South Carolina monitoring system that they have in place to go confirm our analysis, and their own monitoring program itself on the site would give us a good indication if anything was coming off the site, any contaminants were being transported above regulatory limits, whether it's Georgia or South Carolina. So we felt our program was technically adequate. We had the ecology lab, who's independent of the department. Although we give them a grant, they're run by the University of Georgia, and they likewise looked at our report, looked at our technical basis. They had some recommendations, but they concluded that overall they agreed with that. And that's one of the reasons why we supported, because there is some concern on the Georgia side, particularly in Shell Bluff, where some of the residents came to the cabin and expressed some concern that they felt that there were some cancer rates and some other things that were showing up at a higher rate. We created the REMOP program, which was essentially an outreach program to educate the members of Shell Bluff community how an environmental program works. We're actually working with them. It's a 2 to 3 year initiative. We're in, I think, the second year of it now, where we're going to be going out and we educate the community on what a environmental monitoring program is all about, how they're implemented. We'll even work with them to go grab some samples and analyze it within their community, give them a chance. If there's an area that, they'll get real data, and if there is something hot there in those areas that they're most concerned about, our demonstration project would have an opportunity for some information to come out. But I would not expect, given the direction where the prevailing winds are, the prevailing winds go from the southwest to the northeast, groundwater flow, all transports on both sides of the river to the river. I wouldn't expect contaminants that would be transported out at any level to go up against the groundwater flow from into Georgia or upwind in the, if it was dispersed by air.
Yeah.
There was Gil Allensworth, Cap. There was some questions at the end of this presentation about the way DHEC collects and reports as far as the science and I really appreciate Beth and Shelley stepping up and saying that they use the EPA standards and what the government, the federal government sets aside. And I just wanted to make that clear because it was a little uncomfortable to me during the presentation when we were sitting there asking DHEC about the scientific levels of radiation and how they are reporting those to the state. The things that in some way, maybe Michael, maybe it was you, but just explain. One of the things in my time on the CAB that's been remarkable to me is the consistency of the reporting from EPA, DOE, South Carolina DHEC, and there even was a time when Georgia DNR did share. I spoke with someone from Georgia DNR. It could have been 2 years ago, it could have been 3 years ago. And he's like, we've been doing it. He goes, and one of their issues, and I know Michael can't really explain this, but it's like they started looking at it like our numbers were the same for 10 years as EPA, as DOE, as South Carolina DHEC. And so Georgia DNR, I mean, I don't know this, I don't know the inner thinking of everything, but basically he led me to believe that why should we keep spending all the money to do this when we're getting the exact same results? So I'm not speaking for Georgia, I can't speak for Georgia, but it is comforting to see that South Carolina comes up with the same thing that Savannah River Department of Energy comes up with, the same thing that EPA comes up with. And so I appreciate, and I mean, I guess this is just kind of me pontificating, but I really appreciate the consistency that we've seen for years over these monitoring, I would say monitoring agencies, but all the monitoring. So I happen just being out and about in Aiken, I see people and I talk to Beth, and Beth explained it a little bit clearer about, we follow everything to the letter and we do it exactly the same way. So I appreciate it, and it's just amazing to me, the consistency.
I had just a kind of and this is going to sound like a crazy question when you hear it, because it's just a general knowledge question. This is Dan Kaminski, CAB. I was just curious, is there a specific reason for electrofishing? Is it just more efficient? Just zap them?
Greg O'Quinn, South Carolina DHEC, program manager for ESOP. It's just the easy method to utilize for collection of fish, rather than sitting out there with a
I always had
pole.
it that you hired sport fishermen to go up and down the
We have people that would prefer to do that, but it's just the easy method to utilize
Okay.
for sample
Thanks.
collection.
Like I said, it was purely general knowledge question.
Any more questions?
If there's no more questions or discussions on this, Avery.
I just wanted to, Avery Hammett, DOE. Jeff Ross is here from SRS, and so we can get you your answers on Kathy's presentation now if you want to put him in the hot seat.
Does everyone remember their questions? No? Oh.
All right, Avery.
Yeah, coming up to the table. Yeah, I fielded some of them, but I prefer the authority to revise and extend my remarks as necessary.
You can have a seat, that'll work.
Have a seat.
Yeah.
Be careful, Bobby bites.
So anyway, by way of introduction, so I work for the Area Completion Project with SRS, and so I'm one of the tech leads in the reactor areas, and so I have pretty good general knowledge. I probably won't be able to answer everything, but I'll try.
Would you give your name, please?
Yes, it's Jeff Ross. So questions?
Avery,
How far down is the water table at P reactor?
So at P reactor, it's about 50 feet, and it's kind of on a groundwater mound, and so groundwater actually at a number of the sites tends to move radially because a lot of the reactor areas were built up kind of at high locations, and so That's usually actually the farthest distance to groundwater is at where a lot of the facilities are actually built.
And the same question for R.
Our reactor is probably actually the shallowest, and so typically it's about 20 to 30 feet. One of the things that's interesting about R is that the sediments below the surface, there's a lot of clay material in them, and so there tends to be kind of a fluctuating groundwater table as a result of that, because water doesn't infiltrate very readily into those clay-type materials.
Any follow-up questions on this?
Yeah, I'll
Okay.
just ask a follow-up on that. Dan Kaminski, CAB. So what's the distance between the water table and the base of those reactors? How much ground's between the two?
The base of the reactors are actually at as deep as minus 48 relative to ground surface. And so some of the deepest footings at our reactor specifically actually are in contact with groundwater. And so that's not the case at the other areas where the water table is below the base of the reactor at all of the other C, K, L, and P.
Okay. How does rain amount affect groundwater levels?
In terms of kind of a long-term average, we'll see the effects of either extended periods of drought or extended periods of additional rain reflected typically in the uppermost aquifer first. And then sometimes we see that in the deeper aquifers. And so, for example, I guess some of you may have been following kind of the issues with water withdrawal generically across kind of the Midlands area. In the Crouch Branch Aquifer, which is one of the drinking water aquifers for the region, water levels can vary, say, up to 5 feet or so, and so there had actually been we see kind of a general response downward over time with less than average rainfall. We see typically about 50 inches of rain per year on average over the long term, and there's actually a lot of variability locally, and so we can have in some portions of the site, for example, 40 inches, and other portions of the site 60 inches over a given year. In the short term, typically what you'll see is if you have a really big rain event, you can get basically bank discharge, which means you'll see increased levels in some of the streams or creeks, and that may be locally influenced by runoff and or generally the shallow groundwater system. So if we have long periods of extended rainfall, you can see the levels come up in the water table aquifers more quickly than you might see them in the deeper aquifers. So that's probably more detail than you guys wanted, but anyway, I just thought I'd.
Yeah, I actually got that pretty close to being right. Pretty good for not having been in grad school for about 12 years or 15 years.
Next question is, how does tree removal impact groundwater levels? Do you see when an area has been clear cut, is there an impact? Does rain percolate faster or just run off faster? Or
Yeah, that's a good question, and so that right, it is, and so that probably would require like a Forest Service person who's an expert in that, because there's competing factors, and so obviously if you remove trees, you get more runoff because they have a tendency to stabilize the surface soils, but obviously they'll also take water up out of the root systems, and so if you don't have as many trees, and you might have more the rain that doesn't run off probably infiltrates to a greater extent, but in terms of a net effect, I'm not exactly sure.
We're almost done here.
Okay.
When it's time to harvest the trees at the Phyto Pond, do you know what will be done with those?
I do not,
Okay.
and so
We'll get that answered.
Yeah.
And for 3 years as assistant manager, I never thought to ask that. Who asked that? You asked that. Good question.
I think I know the answer, but I'm not sure, so I'm not going to venture it out there.
Let's go find out.
Oh.
I think we'll have to ask, yeah.
Gil Allensworth, Cap, what would happen if you had one of the treated trees and it caught on fire? Would it like go boom?
Mike McLean, Stevie. No, it would not go boom. We did do a study on for the protection of the firefighters that are going, the Forest Service folks that are going out and lighting fires, and the firefighters that have to go in to respond if we had a wildfire situation. And there would be a very small dose release from that, but it was well within occupational. I'm not even going to speculate what the millirem or microrem dose levels were, but it was well within occupational, and which would have been, for the firefighters, it wasn't a health hazard. So if you really want a specific answer, we can go back to that study and find it out. But there would be some small airborne release, obviously, since you're combusting the wood, which would have had the water into the cells of the wood fiber itself.
Doug Howard, Cab. When you all plant trees, do you look at planting trees that are going to absorb more water, or does that matter?
It would probably depend somewhat on the specific environment where we were looking at doing that work. And so in a situation where you're in more of a upland situation, if you're not really close to surface water, typically pine trees grow very well, and they actually have a fairly deep root system. If you get closer to surface water in more of a wetland type environment, pine trees don't do very well, and so in those cases you'd be looking at deciduous trees, willows or some other type of tree that does better, if it has quote-unquote wet feet. And so it might depend on the actual environment that you were in to determine what you would be planting.
Go ahead.
Narendra Malik, are there any artesian wells?
On site?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there are. And so actually, as you get closer to some of the creeks and streams, you'll see a head reversal essentially. And so you'll have the deep aquifer systems, as they're coming towards those systems, actually have a groundwater level that is above what the surface water level would be. And so that's kind of the definition of an artesian well. And so then if you basically have that at the surface, you would have water running out of the well basically into the surface water. And that does occur at various locations at the site where we have a couple of wells. Right, at the seep areas. And so, and that's expected in part, so where you have streams they're gaining, in other words, they're getting groundwater discharge, that's typically where you would have those artesian conditions.
One more, the 85% footprint reduction is based on geographic area, not contamination, correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's what we thought. And then Dan had one question that I didn't capture very well, so I wanted to ask that when he gets back about L basin. That was what I had written down.
Okay. Any other thoughts, questions?
I have that question if you need it.
Dan's question? Yeah, what is it?
Sorry, you guys are going really fast. How far is groundwater from L basin?
So yeah, how far is groundwater from L basin?
So how deep is the groundwater?
Yeah, at L basin. It's probably also about, I'd say 40 to 50 feet. I don't know the exact distance off the top of my head, but it's.
Is it immersed in the footers of the basin, immersed in the groundwater?
No.
That's what I think he was interested in.
Okay. Yeah, I can actually get a specific distance on that if it's of interest. So, okay.
particularly since he's not here to make sure that we got the answer.
Any more questions?
Okay. So if nobody else has any other, actually, Dan, you're here. You're here. We had your L basin question, the distance from groundwater is, you said 40 to 50 feet from the ground to the ground, or the surface to ground.
Yeah, the basin is not actually in groundwater, and so it is below the bottom of the basin. So, but I don't know the exact distance. So I can actually look at some potentiometric maps and get a more specific answer back to you on that.
Thank you. So with that, if you don't have, do you have any other questions or anything that you want to discuss? Narendra, you want to go to public comment?
Close it.
No. Well, let's ask if anybody has any public
If
comment.
anybody has any more questions from public?
Nope.
None? Going 1, 2, 3. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.